Hello, Bay Ridge. Welcome to another edition of After Hours. This week I'm going to be talking about the question of, is the cleansing of the temple actually a sign in John's Gospels? I've been mentioning there are 7 signs in John's Gospel. Scholars are pretty much agreed upon that. John likes to do things in sevens. Signs are a clear important thing both at the beginning of the gospel and at the end of the gospel. He mentions in John 20, 30, and 31 how important they are. And there are at least 6 signs that all scholars agree upon. Everybody agrees that the changing of water to wine in John chapter 2 is a sign. Everyone agrees that the healing of the royal official's son at the end of John chapter 4 is a sign, that the healing of the lame man at the Pool of Bethesda is a sign. Everyone agrees that the feeding of the multitude in John chapter 6 is a sign, that the healing of the blind man in John chapter 9 is a sign, and that finally the resurrection of Lazarus is a sign. So that's 6 signs. The question is then, what is the 7th sign? And there are several different ones that are put forward. There are arguments. The most common one is actually people think it's the walking on the water in John chapter 6 after the feeding of the multitude. Everyone agrees on the 6 that are there because they say that they're clearly called signs either in the story itself or some other time in the gospel they're referred to as signs. And then also they're all miraculous. For that reason, a lot of scholars want to say, well, we like the walking on water as a 7th sign because it is miraculous. But I don't think it actually is the 7th sign. And here's my reason for that. Number one, signs aren't actually necessarily miraculous. That's not what the idea is. The idea is that it is a symbolic event that points to the fact that Jesus is the Son of God, the Messiah, and that we're to put our faith in him. And so whether it's miraculous or not doesn't really answer the question. Secondly, the language of sign actually does not appear in the event of Jesus walking on the water. It's not referred to as a sign in the event, nor is it later referred to as being a sign. Thirdly, and very importantly, there's no note of the disciples placing faith in Jesus or saying they believe because of this sign. And finally, it was not an expected sign of Jesus as the Messiah. There's nothing in the Old Testament that pointed and said Messiah is going to walk on the water. As we saw last week, there was something about the Messiah and wine, and we're going to see about, healing the blind and bringing healing in general, all kinds of things about that, but nothing directly about walking on the water. So then the 7th sign would be something else, I believe, and I actually believe it is the cleansing of the temple. Now, I'm not the first person to argue for this. It's not the dominant position, but a evangelical scholar named Andreas Kostenberger has done a lot of work referencing this. It has been generally gaining more acceptance, and I like some of Kostenberger's arguments, but I wanted to talk briefly about why I believe the temple clearing is actually a sign. Some say that the 2nd sign is the healing of the royal official's son. This is why they don't like the temple cleansing. It's the main argument against it because at the end of that in John chapter 4, verse 54, it mentions that it was the 2nd sign. And they say, well, if it had been the cleansing of the temple, that would be the 3rd sign. But actually it's noting it's the 2nd sign in Galilee. And actually the cleansing of the temple, of course, happened in Jerusalem, and it's letting us know that Jesus is back in Galilee. The scene has changed. So I don't think that's an argument against it. Furthermore, the language of sign actually appears in the text in John chapter 2. The Jewish leaders asked Jesus, what sign can he give? So John's bringing up sign language. In John chapter 2, verse 23, it mentions that many people were seeing the signs Jesus did. Nicodemus, right at the beginning of chapter 3, says, you've been doing these signs in Jerusalem. But oddly enough, there's nothing else mentioned about what he did in Jerusalem to that point other than cleansing the temple. So the only thing that we've seen him actually do is cleansing the temple, but there's this referencing to the signs. There's also the fact that it provides a big contrast with the miracle of changing water into wine and the cleansing the temple. Now, why do I say this? The first one was done, if you notice, up in Cana of Galilee, which is a minor town. This one's being done in Jerusalem. The first one's done at a house in a domestic scene of a wedding. This one's being done at the temple. In Cana, the sign is done privately. This one's being done in the most public spot in all of Jerusalem. And finally, in Cana, it's a sign of blessing. Here, it's a sign of judgment. And we could even note that part of what goes on there is in Cana, the people who saw it believed. In Jerusalem, there are people who do not believe. So there's this contrast, but that shows both aspects of the sign, whether according to how one receives the sign, whether it comes to be blessing or cursing. Now, furthermore, there is the expectation that when Messiah came, he was going to cleanse the temple and he was actually going to be building a new temple. This is a major messianic expectation, which is why the leaders, when Jesus does this, they don't say, why would you be cleansing the temple? They understand some of the things that are going on probably are kind of questionable, but what they recognize is he's making a claim to be the Messiah. So they say, well, what kind of a sign can you give us that you are the Messiah and therefore have the authority to do this? You can notice in the Old Testament, if you read Ezekiel chapter 40 to 48, there are references to the Messiah in the temple. 2 Samuel 7 has references. Zechariah has references, many of these. So the temple is a clear sign of Messiah, unlike the walking on the water. Furthermore, the actual main charge against Jesus when it comes to his trial was that he had declared he was going to destroy the temple and raise a new temple up that was not going to be built with human hands. Well, that's precisely what Jesus says here in the cleansing of the temple in John chapter 2. And finally, if you notice the water to wine and the cleansing of the temple in John chapter 2 lead to what goes on in John 3 and 4. Water to wine shows that we need more than ceremonial washing, which is exactly what Jesus tells Nicodemus. It's not enough to be born of water. You have to be born of the Spirit. And then Jesus is declaring there's going to be a new temple. And that's the discussion with the woman from Samaria where she's saying, which mountain do we worship on? And he says, no, there are times coming when it's not going to be up to the mountain and which temple you're in. God's going to be having worshipers throughout the earth. So these really flow out of these first two signs showing these new covenant realities. And that's why we see in this sign, it specifically states that the disciples believe, which is one of the key elements in the signs. So for all of these reasons, I believe that the cleansing of the temple is actually the second sign. It's a very important event in the life of Jesus, in the structure of the Gospel of John, and in you and I understanding who Jesus is and what he came to do. I hope this is an encouragement to you, and I look forward to seeing everybody as we gather for worship this Sunday. God bless.